All right. So as we move along, we got a few more talks left. Next up is going to be Kadi Kraman, Director of Engineering for Mobile Services at Formidable, talking about handling breaking changes in your GraphQL schema. Kadi, welcome to the stage.
Hi, Brian. Thank you very much.
So, stage is yours. Let's get your presentation up and get you going.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So thank you very much for having me. It's great to have 2 whole days just about GraphQL and amazing people using them. And as you said, I'm going to be talking about something pretty close to my heart because I've been fighting with it quite a bit, which is handling breaking changes in a GraphQL schema. So just a quick intro about me. So hi, my name is Kadi Kraman. I am currently the Director of Mobile Development at Formidable. So Formidable, if you've not heard of us, we're a JavaScript consultancy, but we're pretty heavily invested into GraphQL. I'm pretty sure every single project I've done at Formidable has involved GraphQL, and we've also done some open source in the GraphQL space. So for me personally, I think the first GraphQL API I ever built was around 2017, which was quite a while ago. And since then, I worked with both small and large-scale projects. And mostly, I've actually been an API consumer rather than the one writing the API. So I would say about 20% of my time was writing the API, and 80% of my time was on the client side consuming the API. So I've definitely seen it more from that side of things. So let's get on to breaking changes. So start with a definition. A breaking change is in a GraphQL schema is an update to the schema that causes the API contract to change, but change in a way that is not backwards compatible. And the best way to see it is by example. So I've got an example here. And on the left, we see a schema, and it's quite a little one. So we just have a single query where you can query a user by ID, and it returns a user type, and the user type just has 2 fields, an ID and a name. And on the right, you can see this query being executed, and where we have the query, and then we have the data that comes back. And say that you've implemented the schema on your project, and it's been deployed, it's being used, and then the business comes back and says, actually, we want the name to be 2 fields. So you want to have the first name and the last name separate. Now, it might be tempting to do something like this. So you'll add 2 fields, you'll add the first name and the last name, and because you don't need the name field anymore, you'll just remove it. However, if there was a client already using it, you can see on the right that now querying the same query as we did before, we will not get any data back, we will in fact get an error. So I'm getting an error saying, cannot query field name on the type user. And this is correct because the name field doesn't exist anymore. And this is an example of a breaking change or a change that is not backwards compatible because a query that worked on a previous version of this API no longer works after this change. Here's how you would make the same change, but make it backwards compatible. Instead of removing the name field altogether, I'm going to add a deprecation notice. So I'm going to use a deprecated directive, and I'm going to, in brackets, add the reason for the deprecation. So in this case, I'm telling the consumer of the API that this field is deprecated in favor of these 2 new fields, first name and last name. And on the right, you can see that the existing query that we initially used with just the ID and name works perfectly, as well as the new query that we want all of our clients to migrate to with the first name and last name. The deprecated directive, if you have not seen it before, it allows you to tag the schema definition of a field or an enum value as deprecated and provide a reason. It is part of the GraphQL spec, which means that any GraphQL server really should be implementing it. And the really cool thing is that most IDEs, GraphQL tools, and clients will pick up this notification, and actually they'll warn you if you're using a deprecated field. So on the right, in my example, so I'm using Insomnia as a GraphQL client, and you can see that when I'm viewing a field, so I'm viewing my GraphQL schema, I'm viewing the user type, and next to name, I got a little exclamation mark. And when I hover over it, I see that the field name is deprecated, and it also gives me a deprecation notice that I gave it, and it says that it's deprecated in favor of first name and last name. Now, sometimes you might need to include breaking changes, and I'm going to show you a way that you can do it relatively safely. The main thing to remember is the 4 steps: add, deprecate, migrate, and remove. And I'm going to go through all 4 steps using an example. So we're going to start with our same user type with just the ID and a name. And we have our whole platform. So we have a website, let's say it's an Next.js app. We have our API, which of course is a GraphQL API. And we have our mobile apps, which are in React Native. So these are 3 separate code bases, and they have 3 separate deployment pipelines. So the first version, we got Web 1, API 1, and App 1. They are all using the user type, as you see on the left, with the ID and the name. Now our first step, which is the add, we're going to add the first name and last name. So we're going to add the new fields into the schema. And the second step, deprecate, usually we will do the first and a separate step together. We will add the deprecation notice to any fields that we don't want any clients to use anymore. After we've done these 2 changes, add and deprecate, we will now release our new version of our API. So we're going to release API 2. Now, because we made this change in a backwards compatible way, both Web 1 and App 1 are still compatible with the latest API 1, so no breaking changes have happened. The next step is migrate. At this point, we need to migrate all clients, so anyone consuming this API, to stop using the deprecated API and start using the new fields that we just added. After this is done, we've added the change, and we will deploy the new versions of our website and our application. And then the last step, when we're confident that no clients are using the deprecated fields anymore, we can remove this field. So we removed name from the user type, and we can deploy our new version of our API. At this point, API 3 is not compatible with Web 1 or App 1. However, it doesn't matter because those versions are no longer being used, and it is compatible with Web 2 and App 2. Now, I wouldn't be a mobile developer if I didn't go on a tangent at this point on why this is so much harder for mobile applications. On a high level, this is what deploying websites and APIs look like. You finished your V2, you're going to release it to a Lambda or AWS or whatever you do, and as soon as it's released, 100% of your users are going to be viewing that version of the code. When you're ready with your V2, you will release that the same way as you did V1. It replaces V1, and as soon as it's ready, 100% of your users will be using V2, and 0% will be using V1. And so on. So when you're ready with V3, you will release it. As soon as it's released, 100% of your users will switch to V3, and no one will be using the previous versions. This seems pretty obvious. However, this is not how it works on mobile development. We start off the same. So when we're finished with V1 of our application, we will submit it to the App and Play Store approval, and once it's approved, we can publish it to the stores. Now at this point, 100% of our users will be using V1 because that is the only version of the application ever published. However, things get not so great when we do V2. So we're finished V2, we're doing the same process, we get it approved, we will upload it to the stores, we will check back 2 weeks later, and we see that only 60% of our users are using V2, and 40% are still using V1. Now we're working on V3. We finish V3, we'll go through the approval, we'll publish to the store. 2 weeks later, we come back and we'll find that 65% of users are using V3. Only 30% of users are using V2, and for some reason, 5% of users are still using V1. At this point, you can see that even though it's been 6 weeks since V1 and we already have a V3, there are still users on previous versions. And why does this happen? Well, mobile app releases never get 100% adoption because apps only get updated if the user has automatic updates turned on, or if they explicitly go to the store listing page and update manually. A lot of users have automatic updates turned off just because of their preference, and even if the automatic updates are turned on, they will really only update when you are connected to the Wi-Fi and when you're plugged in. So there is no guarantee of users getting the latest versions of your app. Then you might ask, when is it safe to make a breaking API change if the API was used by a mobile app? And really the answer that you don't want to hear is that it's never safe to make such a breaking change. However, in some cases, you really have to make a breaking change. And there are ways to make it a bit less painful and a little bit more likely to succeed. And one thing that a lot of mobile developers would program in to the previous versions of your app is a blocking app upgrade prompt. And this is basically a pop-up that you would show your users when they launch the app, prompting them to upgrade from the store and blocking them from using the app otherwise. Now, this is usually coded in, but it is something that we use as a last resort because users don't like it, it's not a good user experience, and Apple also doesn't like it. However, so as I was actually writing these slides, I was thinking that I haven't seen an app upgrade prompt recently, and I saw one today. This is from Harvest, which is an app that I use, and when I opened it, I got this alert, which is saying that this version of Harvest is deprecated. I need to go to the App Store to get the latest version. So when I click on Learn More, I'll go to the App Store and it will make me upgrade, and I can't use the app otherwise. From the App Store, I saw that they've actually rebuilt the app completely, so presumably this version is no longer supported. The other thing you would have to do is, at this point, you have made your users upgrade as much as possible, but you might have to notice that even at this point, I can choose not to upgrade. So here, I still have to go to the App Store and press upgrade, but I could choose to not do it because I'm not connected to Wi-Fi and I don't want to use my mobile internet, or I just decide that I don't want to use the mobile app and I'm going to use the website. So even at this point, I'm not guaranteed to upgrade. So then you will have to monitor the query usage in other ways, both on the API level and on the app level. So on the app level, you can monitor query usage with logging and generating metrics that will allow you to observe the usage of deprecated fields. So you will see that if no one is calling those fields, it's probably safe to remove them. You can also monitor your app's active users for each app version to gauge the number of users a breaking change would affect. And if the number of active users would fall below a certain threshold, you can decide, if it's acceptable to your business, then you can decide to make the change. All right, let's do a slightly different topic. Which one of these is a breaking change? So we're still on the user type, and on the left, I've made the name field, which was mandatory, optional, and on the right, I've made the optional field mandatory. Did you say the left one? It's actually not clear to see why one of these is a breaking change, so I've written it out using some code that you would use on your front end. So here, this is something that your client might be using with this API. So my user type has an ID and a name, both being mandatory, and I might have a utility function to get the first name from the user type. So I'm just calling split on the name and getting the first item before the space. Now this was before the change. If I made the name optional, meaning that it could be null, TypeScript actually helps me out here and immediately tells me that I can't call split on this value, because if I called split on a null, I would get a JavaScript exception. Let's do another one. Here we have a query, and this time I've changed the input type. So on the left, I've changed the input type from mandatory to optional, and on the right, I'll change it from optional to mandatory. Did you say the right one? So interestingly, for inputs, is actually the other way around. If you change the input from optional to mandatory, it's a breaking change. Now, the reason I put these in diffs is because it is really, really easy to miss this in a code review. Thankfully, there are tools to help us. If you haven't encountered GraphQL Inspector before, I would absolutely recommend it. We're using it currently on my project. It does a bunch of things, but the best thing for us is that it allows you to spot breaking changes on pull requests. So here's, you can use any kind of CI. We're using GitHub Actions, so I'm just going to show you how you would set it up on GitHub Actions. So this is from a GitHub Action workflow, and the main point of it is that we are checking in our GraphQL schema, and we are saying, okay, compare the schema in this PR to the schema on our main branch, so the branch that we are going to be merging into. And then actually on the PR, you will end up with these notices. So on the left, we have an example of a breaking change. So you can see that we have, so this will cause the PR check to fail as well, because we've set that to fail. And so here, the removing types from a schema is always a breaking change. And on the right, that's another cool thing. So this is not a warning or an error. It's just for your information. So it's for the reviewer, just to draw their attention to things being added to the GraphQL schema, so they would make sure to review it. And because we've opted to fail on breaking changes, there's also an option to add a label which will allow you to bypass this check. So at this point, if you raise the PR, someone's review it, and they've said, yes, I agree, in this case, this breaking change is allowed, we will add the approved breaking change label, and the GitHub check will pass, and we can merge it. So just to recap, breaking changes in GraphQL are renaming fields, deleting fields, changing the data type, making a required field optional, or making an optional input required. You should avoid breaking changes whenever possible, but if introducing a breaking change is avoidable, use the add, deprecate, migrate, remove method to minimize the risk of users being affected. And finally, if you haven't used it already, I would absolutely check out GraphQL Inspector and add it to your PR checks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kadi. So well, as we wait for questions to come in, let's give a round of applause with emojis in chat. And let me just say that I think that the idea of deprecation notices inside of GraphQL, inside of APIs, is so important to a strong developer experience, because no one wants that like intense sorrow that comes when all of a sudden the API breaks your code. Do you have any suggestions around what those kind of notices can say, or language that you've seen kind of come in that soften the blow in better ways?
I think the most important thing for deprecation notices is, what do I do instead? So the deprecation notice is actually optional, so you don't have to put anything there. But like basically, if something's used and I'm using it, I want to know, how do I continue to get the same information? I think that's the only thing. So no one's going to be happy to see deprecated fields, but at least if they know how to migrate. It's the same with like when you do UX and you show users error notices. So they want to know what went wrong and what can they do about it. And it's the same kind of thing.
There's actually, I come from a UX background, so it's hard for me to like let that go. And like that's one of the criteria from the Nielsen Norman group about usability is how many errors a user has, and then how easily can they recover from it. And the same goes for developer experience as well. Let's make sure that they can recover.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I mean, I think it's so I consume, like I said, I consume GraphQL APIs a lot more than I build them. But I'm always adjacent to building them, and I usually contribute into them. But as a result, because the web and the API tend to be developed together, a lot of the time a developer will develop the API and then do the front end change for this API. And then I'm over here on the mobile app going, hold on, what does this API do? It doesn't make any sense. So I'm the API consumer, and I'm very invested in making that clearer. And a lot of the time I tell the developer like, oh, that doesn't actually make sense. And they're like, oh yeah, I didn't think about it like that, because I was only thinking about it in relation to this change that I'm making. And it's easy to miss.
Yeah. So we got a question in chat from Alex. Are different groups of developers reacting in different ways to breaking changes in your experience?
I'm not sure. As in, are some more upset than others? I guess so, but we tend to be, I guess, upset quietly or on Slack with angry emojis.
Sure.
So I think because we don't see a lot of it, we don't see if people are as upset.
I feel like if nothing else, watching your versioning part of the presentation, I could see mobile app developers being more upset about breaking change because they know that their users aren't going to update to the new versions.
Oh yeah, I mean, for that point of view, yeah, it's like if maybe so. I am here giving a talk about breaking changes to raise awareness.
Exactly.
So yeah, maybe that's true. I think it's like if you were on the web, then you would make a change and you deploy it, and then I would say within, I mean, if you go good deployment pipeline, maybe 30 minutes, you could go from nothing to having everything fixed. But for the mobile app, so for example, right now, if I found that there was something serious going on in production that needed a code change, then if I did the code change right now, with the app review process and with the CI builds, at a minimum, it would be a day and a half to 2 days for this to even reach the stores, and then after which it would still take weeks for people to upgrade. So we're very sensitive to breaking changes. And also the other part is, if your website is broken, generally people complain on Twitter and maybe send you some messages. But if your app is broken, they will post reviews on the App Store and you'll have 0-star reviews. This app doesn't work, it's the worst. So obviously we're feeling it a lot more.
Yeah, totally. Let's see. We also have a question from Ty Cooper. Are there any VS Code extensions that could be used to detect things like the breaking changes that you mentioned?
Yes, there is. I think I can't remember exactly what it's called, but if you search on the VS Code store, there definitely are. That's like one of the things, because the deprecation notice is part of GraphQL spec. So anywhere you can view GraphQL schema, you can kind of view it.
Perfect. And I think we'll give a second or two for more questions, but I think that's going to be it. So thank you so much for presenting and teaching us about deprecation and breaking changes in GraphQL.
Thank you, Brian. That was awesome.